Hello, art history class. I just want to remind you to be reading your book. We are in chapter 8, which is called Late Antiquity. It's a pretty interesting chapter, has a lot to do with just after the Roman Empire. Well, I shouldn't say that. It's actually part of the Roman Empire, but it's a period of time that's sort of right before Constantine, around his time, and then after Constantine as well. The main thing that's different about it than the previous chapter is that it has to do with subject matters that have to do with Christianity and the rise of that in the Roman Empire, as well as some stuff about Judaism. But we shouldn't think of it as a completely separate chapter time period from chapter 7 because it has a lot of overlap. It's more the subject matter that's specifically different. So we're going to get started on the slideshow and have a look at the different pieces. It's a pretty interesting chapter, and we'll be going over some of the history of that time period, and then it'll tie into the history of Christianity as well as the history of the next chapters, Byzantine, and then it leads us into the medieval era type of stuff as well. So they're all kind of linking together. So a lot of the concepts and things and the visual imagery we're going to be talking about here, we need to understand for the future chapters as well. Okay, I hope you're all doing well and reading your book. Take care, and I will talk to you soon. As ever, if you have questions or need help with anything, please contact me via Canvas, email, Zoom, Pronto, all the different ways. Okay, take care. So, moving on with Chapter 8, Late Antiquity, we will be looking at stuff that is Roman in the classical sense and subject matter, Jewish, and also Christian work. The Jewish and early Christian is before Constantine and after Constantine. The earliest soldier emperors was a time of crisis. But first, let's just say this is the part of the world we're looking at geographically. Rome being here. We're going to look at some sites in Dura, Europos, Ravenna. There's some in your book, Thessaloniki. So there's different places, but this is the basic Roman Empire at that time, the Mediterranean world of late antiquity. And this is sort of the time period we're looking at here before Justinian and the Byzantine Empire, so around this type of time period. The earliest soldier emperors of the mid 3rd century um, is an important time, kind of that things were going all crazy. And then the sack of Rome is an important date on here, as well as Christianity is made the state religion here, and then it's made legal in 313. That's called the Edict of Milan. Those are some things that are important for you to point out on this timeline, the dates. So the chapter has some post-Constantine classical subjects. Constantine is a really important guy in this chapter because of the Edict of Milan and because of the way he changed the Roman Empire. But we shouldn't think of this chapter as any less Roman. The technique is the same, and in a lot of cases, even the style is the same. It's mostly that the subject and functions are very different from previous chapters and chapter 7. And as I said a moment ago, we could think of this chapter and also chapter 9, the Byzantine Empire, bridging to the ancient and bridging the ancient to the medieval chapters. So these chapters kind of take us from the classical world into the medieval stuff and some of the subject matter that begins to change in the ways in which they depict it continue to develop on for quite a long time. So it's important in the sense that, well, in its own right, in history, it's important, but it's also important for you to understand this stuff so that you can take this knowledge into the next couple chapters for the course and the way that it relates to the bridge between the two things. I want to also say in this that the early Christian art, the term that we're going to be using, and the earliest Christian art, it just means the earliest surviving art. It does not mean that the artists were alive at the time of Christ. That is not the case. And it doesn't mean that there wasn't art before this either that was Christian. It just means these are the earliest examples that we have and that we know of. Okay? Some goals that we need to go over. I want you to understand the influence of religion in the art of the Roman Empire in late antiquity, examining art forms and the architecture of this period, understanding some different media used to create early Christian art, and also we want to find Roman stylistic features that are incorporated into this, and then be able to cite artistic and architectural terminology. Okay? Our first site we're going to be looking at is Dura Europos in Syria, modern-day Syria. It's an interesting place because it's often called the Pompeii of the desert. If you remember from last chapter, Pompeii was a town that was buried in ash by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, and it was left intact. Well, this town, this Roman garrison, was abandoned, also intact, in 256 when it fell to an invading force. And so because of that, there were shrines to the polytheistic religion there, their classical religion, as well as there was a Jewish synagogue and Christian place of worship, so some monotheistic sites as well that are an important part of this find. Pretty remarkable, really, that the monotheistic ones, especially that the Jewish synagogue exists in a Roman garrison town from this time. This is the interior of the synagogue at Dura Europos in Syria. These are wall paintings, pretty interesting work. We're going to look at one of them in particular, but first off, just want to talk about the function of this as a place of worship. So synagogue is a house of worship for the Jewish faith. This faith was not a state-sponsored religion, so it actually was a real house, domestic house that was converted into a synagogue. We're looking at tempera on plaster. A lot of times when we've been seeing wall painting up until now, we've been seeing frescoes, which are pigments applied to wet plaster. This is not painted into wet plaster. It's tempera, so it has a binder, and most often the binder was egg. And people still do tempera painting today using egg with pigment to create the paintings. This niche you're going to see right here in the middle, this one right here, is actually a place for keeping the Torah. This one right here. Okay. And the Torah is scripture. It's common to the Old Testament of the Bible, so the Jews would call it the Torah. This is kind of a surprising discovery because a lot of historians often thought there would not be any painting or imagery in synagogues like this because of the second commandment that we'll talk about in a couple of times throughout this, because of it's one of the 10 commandments of prohibition for graven images. So there isn't any imagery of Yahweh, God, in this. So that's the Jewish name for God. In this, there's one part that has sort of hand that points that possibly could be, but overall it's all scenes from the Torah. This is a scene of Samuel. This figure here is Samuel. He's anointing David, King David, and this is an anointing of oil, horn of oil being poured over him. He's David in a royal robe of purple, a toga, and Samuel is distinguished by being larger, It's a kind of hierarchical scale, but maybe we could say it's especially in a design sense to distinguish him from all these other figures, which are David's brothers. It comes from an Old Testament narrative where Samuel is told to anoint the future king of Israel, and he goes to the house of Jesse, and there's all these brothers that get called out one by one, and none of them are the right one. And so David, who is a shepherd in the field, is the last one called in, and he's the one who's anointed. This is the same materiality as above, the tempera, and the function, of course, is the same because it's part of these big murals. Some of the stylistic things I want to point out are that this is all based on sort of a stylized gesture. If you see how their hands are in certain styles, almost geometric feeling, and their robes and the quality of that. It doesn't have a lot of shadow or volume in these. They feel almost like they're kind of almost floating. And there's a total mostly all frontal focus in all of the murals, right? What do I mean by that? Their faces are straight at us. Okay, this is common for almost all the murals. And they're very expressionless. If you see, their faces are pretty much deadpan. Not a lot of movement in the eyes or the face. So all the murals have this sort of common style of expressionless, not a lot of volume or shadow, mostly frontal focused, and stylized gestures. This is another stylized gesture where he's pouring the oil over David. Interesting work, though. And I think we could see some commonalities in it compared to some other things we've seen in chapter 7, the Roman work. We didn't see as much painting, though, but yeah, we can see commonalities in the way that their clothing is, using purple for royalty. There was also found in this location in Syria a house of worship, a Christian house that was also converted from a regular house, a dwelling. And then we have here the courtyard, the meeting hall, and the baptistry. So there were some murals that were part of this, but they have not survived very well in the baptistry. Christianity also is not a state-sponsored religion, so this is it doesn't become legal until 313. So there's a lot of it makes a lot of sense why it would be a house that had been converted. Why was Christianity so unpopular? There's a lot of different things people will say, but we could mostly just point out that there was a system in the Roman world of paying homage to the classical gods that we've seen in Greece and Rome, and also deified emperors, right? We talked about this quite a bit in chapter 7 with people who are saying things like, I am like the gods, right? And if you remember back to some pieces of Augustus where he had Cupid on him, and things like that, because he's saying he's related to the gods. So same idea here. There's a classical ideal of that. And this system is a lot of the basis of imperial power, the emperor's power. And because Christians did not pay homage to the classical gods or these deified emperors, not even in a token sort of way, then they're upsetting the balance of power. And this idea that the emperor stands in between the people and the gods and their power position. So there was periods of time in the Roman in this era where there was a really intense persecution under Trajan, Decius, and Diocletian, for example, and Romans were murdered for their beliefs. That kind of leads us into the next site that we're going to be looking at, the catacombs in Rome. So we're going from Duro Europus back to Rome, and we're going to look at the catacombs. Pretty interesting places. So because there were all these times when Christianity was illegal in the Roman Empire, these may have been places of hiding and also at times used for worship experiences, like not services, not experiences. But a couple of goals real quick. We want to understand how and why religious ideas were expressed in art of the early Christian period and the origins and development of images of Christ. We're going to talk quite a bit about those, so look for that. These catacombs were actually underground, and they were thought to be possibly purchased of old mines or dug themselves. But a huge part of it is because they did not want to bury their dead with unbelievers or people who believe differently than them, the polytheists. They also did not want to cremate their dead because they believed in the resurrection. So this is part of what started these vast network of catacombs. That there's said to be between 60 and 90 miles of these tunnels that are underground, dug in the tufa bedrock. So these people, this group did not want to be a part of the system. They thought of Christ as the King of the Jews, and this was treason to Romans, and they wouldn't participate in these festivals that honored the divinity of the emperor and state. So they had private houses of worship like Zero Europus, and they also had their own private places of burial that we'll also see a Jewish example of this as well. So these are like underground cemeteries. And you'll see and hear all these wall shelves called loculi. This is where they would have buried different bodies. There's approximately 4 million Christians that were buried in the catacombs up until about 400 AD. And half of these are currently open to the public. They have churches built over the entrances of them to honor the martyrs and the places in a number of locations. In these, they used to have, and some of them still exist, stone plaques that would have inscriptions for the dead on here, and some types of drawings, and some plaques that would cover over the openings completely. By the 5th century AD, they were buried. Christians were buried above ground, and then eventually all the bodies were removed and buried above ground. But this is a really extensive network, and it's going to be a place where we're going to see some of the earliest Christian art. And we also see here an early Jewish site. They also had a few catacomb sites. This is an example of a Jewish wall painting fresco in a catacomb. It depicts the menorahs on each side and the Ark of the Covenant in the middle, which has to do with God's presence in the Holy of Holies, the Ark of the Covenant, and the House of the Ten Commandments, for example. And then the menorahs are also about God's presence. They're part of a festival of lights that celebrate the rededication of the Second Temple with the Maccabean revolt. So people still celebrate that today with Hanukkah. But this was one of the wall paintings inside of a Jewish catacomb site. But there's a lot more of these that are early Christian catacomb. Most of them are early Christian, and they have these type of wall decorations, paintings, as well as other types of inscriptions, and this is where they would have had bodies buried. Some pretty ornate decorations inside of these. And so these are the first themed art that we know of Christian art. And this is one we're going to talk a bit about. It's called The Good Shepherd. It has the story of Jonah around it in these lunettes. And these figures here are called orants. They're praying type of figures. It's from the early 4th century. This is showing it kind of in sight looking up at the ceiling with some of these openings. So the earliest of all these kind of paintings that we ever saw in here is from about 200 AD. So no artist had ever seen Jesus in person. These are all types that they used. There's also other scenes that appear of Adam and Eve, and definitely quite a few of Jonah. The book talks quite a lot about it, and we'll talk about him in this here, who is basically a prophet in the Old Testament who was disobedient and ran from God, got on a boat, and there was a storm, and so they prayed, and Jonah told them to throw him over into the water, and he was swallowed by a sea monster. Often people say a whale. This is that right here, on this little lumet over here, swallowing him. And then he was in the belly of the whale for 3 days and 3 nights, and then spit back on dry ground, and then he goes off to Nineveh to give them the message that God had told him to give, which is to repent and they'll be saved. So this symbolism appears a lot inside of the catacombs because it is what we would call an Old Testament typology or prefiguration of Christ and his death and resurrection. This is something that he would have said while he was alive, as recorded in the Bible, that it's the sign of the prophet of Jonah that he would die and then be buried for 3 days and then rise again. So we see a lot of Jonah being put in the different sculptures and paintings inside of the catacombs and other places as well. And we'll continue to see this in other chapters too. So let's look at the center round section, rondola, in a little more detail. These are the orants. There's a child, a woman, and a man. Part of it's been damaged. It's supposed to be like a cross section of all of the Christian community praying. Possibly, they say, generic portraits of some of the people buried here. I've read about that at times. But let's look at this middle panel. It's called Christ as the Good Shepherd. It's a fresco from 4th century AD. It's obviously religious in nature, and we know the function is to be a part of the catacombs inside this burial location, so it's funerary art. It's on the ceiling of a cubiculum in the catacomb of St. Peter and Marcellinus. It's in the middle of that ceiling, and it's painted into wet plaster. We can see that in here Christ is shown pretty realistically, and he's in contrapposto. It's hard to get really good clean close-ups of this. You can see it here again. He's in contrapposto with his leg bent and the other one straight. And he's holding a sheep over his shoulders. This is an interesting and common theme we'll see in this chapter, him as a shepherd. He's a very youthful figure, and he has short hair like a Roman. There's quite a bit of 3D modeling and shadow and highlights. So the symbolism of this here is there's a New Testament idea of him being an ancestor of David, the Old Testament king we saw earlier. This is and David was a shepherd, so there's an idea of him being a shepherd because of belief in him being the Messiah, which is a fulfillment of prophecy, that a king would come. So that's part of why he's shown as a shepherd. The other part is because he said of himself that he cared for his flock like a shepherd cares for their sheep, and so it's a caring sort of idea of being caring for the people who belong to him, basically. We have a statue of him like this as well. I think it's interesting because a lot of times people nowadays think of images and see images of Christ being with a beard and a lot more mature, older figure. And this is a lot of the early portrayals are of a youthful shepherd and sometimes a teacher, because that idea of like the beard and the mature version didn't actually set in until later and became more of like a standard thing. But this is because they're really trying to highlight this idea of him being the shepherd of Israel's people and caring for them like a flock. These statues are really, there's not so many of these. It's pretty uncommon. There were still being a lot of statues being made during this time for the classic sort of works by emperors and for polytheistic temples and things like that. But part of why they're not so common in the Christian versions of them is because there were a lot of ideas about the second commandment of no graven images taken to be don't make these type of sculptural works. You could hear or read about things like this in Apologia by Justin the Martyr. Different people would have said this, so it's pretty common for there not. It's not so common for there to be as many statues. Sometimes we will get some of them from people, probably recent converts would have had these because they still had their Greco-Roman sensibilities to have them made. But they're not life size. It's about 3 feet and a quarter inches here. But you see that he's also in contrapposto. You can tell by the hips, see, and the shoulders, and the straight leg and the bent knee. And you see it's pretty realistic. He's feeling very Roman, and he's got the sheep over his shoulders. Quite a bit of realism to this, albeit it's fairly idealized, which is to be expected from Roman work and for the subject matter. It's pretty realistic though in all of these versions, and a lot of anatomical accuracy, I guess, is what we should say. It's got a lot of similarity to the fresco in its subject matter, and it's just like another depiction of that. Another one of these that's a bit different, the statue I showed you a second ago, is him seated, Christ seated. Another of these rarer statues is interesting because he's seated like a philosopher, so this is more of a teaching type of depiction. Some of the teachings of Jesus that are really famous are the Sermon on the Mount, also called the Beatitudes. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall inherit the earth. A number of blessed statements are part of the beginning of that, the Beatitudes. He also taught that God's a loving Father. His basic idea about moral right action was the golden rule: do unto others as you would have them do unto you. He also taught that sin can be redeemed and forgiven, that life is eternal, that we live as an afterlife, and that He is the way to that eternal life, and that we should care for the poor and our neighbors and have compassion. So those are the basic teachings that people would talk about a lot of times. Also, he claimed to be God, and that is part of why he's so controversial and has been one of the most influential figures in human history. We could say that for a lot of reasons. This cubiculum here shows more of a depiction that would be more what we would think of nowadays with a bearded, more mature version of Christ. This is it in place, and this is also in the catacombs. So just want to kind of show that as a developmental stage, that before this kind of depiction began to happen, we had a long time of these more youthful versions happening. And eventually, when these bearded versions became the main standard way of showing him, it was partially because this happened because Christianity became the official religion of the empire in 380, and we started to get more of this type of halo that you see over here over the head, which is about being a holy person, and then robes of power. and we'll later on see a lot of purple being used because it's the emperor's color. So, but that stuff happens later, and it keeps developing more and more as we go along. As I said, there's other type of common themes. We already talked about Jonah as a typology. We also see commonly in a lot of Christian art, early Christian art, and later you'll see it as well, depictions of Adam and Eve, and this is basically seen depicting that Garden of Eden that they're in, and the serpent who tempted Eve to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and she gave some, and Adam also ate. And this is the idea of expulsion from Eden, the original sin where they went against God and sin entered the world, and so they're no longer able to live in union with Him. And this is a common theme because, Christ is considered in the New Testament as the second Adam, come to redeem and restore our relationship with God. So we see a lot of those depictions as well as the sacrifice of Isaac, which we'll see a picture of that in a second, because it was also considered a typology of God sacrificing His Son, Jesus, the only begotten Son, for our sins. So you'll see that as a common thing. I want to give you a brief overview of the Judeo-Christian heritage. These themes will be in the next chapters, as I said. They continue a long time into art history. If you take the next class after this, you'll see a lot of this stuff in Renaissance and on and on. It's a huge part of art history. So we don't have, obviously, time to go over a great amount of detail of this. You could go and study this for a whole degree, basically. And there's plenty of people who have done that. But basically, there was the ancient kingdom of Judah and Israel, and they had some different parts of their history where you have like the call of Abraham, we'll see the patriarch, and then they end up in Egypt and they get out of Egypt, and then they have a period of conquering and becoming, they have judges that come over them, and then they have a kingship with David, and then exile and post-exile. So there's a lot of detail in that, but mostly you'll see a lot of references to Abraham, to David and the monarchy, and then we'll see some things to the period of, like I said, the Old Testament prophets like Jonah and things like that. This is the sort of land that we're talking about here. The modern day country of Israel is over here, and it's been a part of land that's been inhabited for a really long time. It's close to, in part of like the ancient Near East, so it's an area of land that's been much disputed and fought over and conquered for a really long time. What's so specific about Judaism and also Christianity as part of that is it is a monotheistic religion, which is completely different from much of the world religions. There's not a lot of them. There were none before Judaism. It's the first one. And in a way, we could say that Christianity stems out of that because they believe that Jesus was a Messiah, something who was foretold in the Old Testament. And then we could even say that Islam in some way also springs out of Judaism. We will go over that in the next chapter. So it's monotheistic covenant between Abraham and God. It's the first time in the history of the world, and it was a covenant is a two-part agreement between God and people in this case. And we kind of see remnants of that in ideas like on the American dollar bills, "In God We Trust," it says. Part of it was a prohibition of images of God. There's no idols or statues. Man could not make God. He was forever, eternal, and powerful. And another part of the covenant is that Yahweh is the sacred name of God. He's wholly separate and wholly different. And we see a lot of, in the Old Testament, ideas of prophecy, foretelling. Another part of it is moral law, which is the Ten Commandments are the most known, probably commands in the whole world overall. And there's commonalities between them and other old laws. Basically, that was given to Abraham when he was turned aside because a bush was burning, but it wasn't being consumed. And we talked a bit about this a second ago, being inside of the Ark of the Covenant and that depiction of the Ark of the Covenant. So this is about the law of Judaism, basically, the moral law of it. That's a really, really, really basic, idea of some of it, but there's obviously a lot more to it, and I don't mean to gloss over it, but I don't want to get too deeply into all the minutiae of it. But I think it's important to understand really basics of it, because much of what we know about the world and the Western culture has been really influenced by the Bible, Christianity, Judaism. So it's important to understand the context of this stuff. And then, of course, the classical world was changed by it as well, and that's kind of what we're talking about in this chapter. It's a huge part of it. Your book goes over a lot of sections about Jesus's life and ministry, the kind of scenes that would especially show up, as well as different saints and things that we'll look at. So make sure you read those parts as well. I want to try to add to the book rather than just parrot it exactly. So how does this tie into the Roman Empire? Why are we talking about all this stuff? You're wondering probably. Well, this is a arch of Titus. You may remember it from the last chapter. It's a triumphal arch about his conquering of Jerusalem. And you can see on this inside panel right here that this is the menorahs being taken away, because Titus, a Roman emperor, conquered Israel in about 63 BC, and Jews did not like it. Of course, no one likes being conquered, but part of it was because they did not like polytheism. They wanted their own religion, and they felt that their culture was being corrupted by being under Roman authority and puppet kings like Pilate and Herod, people like that in the New Testament. So they were very, very, very much anxious to have the Romans kicked out of their country, have it back, and also to, at different times, have revolts, which they did later on in 70 AD, have a famous revolt. But during this time where Rome was occupying Israel was when Christ was born, and also when he died. He died in approximately 33 AD, Jesus. Some of his followers expected him to rise up and defeat the Romans and to be a conquering king. That's their idea of being a Messiah, as prophesied about in the Old Testament. But he depicted himself as a different type of suffering servant who came to restore us to God, rather than just to kick out the Roman Empire. So the Jews weren't happy about that, and some people who were Jewish, the early followers of Christ were Jewish, believed him to be the Messiah and followed him, and others did not and carried on with their religion as it was. So he died in 33 AD in a Roman-occupied Jerusalem and was crucified by Roman soldiers. He's mentioned outside of the Bible in a lot of different sources. Josephus in 100 BC, he's a Jewish historian, wrote about him. Not a Christian Jew, but a Jewish Jew. A Jewish faith, I should say. Tacitus, a Roman historian, wrote about him in 100 BC. Pliny the Younger, also a Roman governor in Turkey, wrote a letter to Emperor Trajan mentioning him. So whatever you believe, and this class is not about changing your belief structure, but just representing the worldview that these people had and they were making art from. Whatever you believe about the resurrection and who Christ was, it's very clear, and I would say that any decent historian wouldn't argue the fact that Jesus was a real historical person who really lived and really died. Um, the points of contention and end up being about what he actually said or didn't say, and whether or not he was God, or if he rose from the dead or not. These are the type of things that are debated, obviously, very, very intensely, and have had a lot of effect on our world. But no matter what you believe about it, you shouldn't be trying to say that he didn't exist as a person and didn't die and wasn't living in this part of the world during this time. Pretty much everyone who's a reputable historian would agree with that. Okay? We'll see a lot of different depictions of the four evangelists who were the writers of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the four Gospels. Matthew and John are also two of the 12 apostles or disciples. There's other ones, especially one that we'll see a lot of mention of is Peter, who was the head of the early church. And some would say that Mark wrote the gospel based on what Peter was saying, the Gospel of Mark, one of the evangelists. There's a lot of commonalities between Christianity and Judaism in that the roots of it are very much a part of Judaism. Jews believe in a Messiah, and the prophets write about it in the Old Testament. And then Christians believe that Jesus was the Messiah. So a lot of the Sabbath rituals of worship, singing, reading come from styles that originated in Judaism. There's also some commonalities of Roman and classical antiquity, natural law with Roman Stoic philosophy that we're all created equal. There's Platonic divine philosophy that we have an eternal soul that isn't divine. One could argue that they already believed in these things in the Jewish faith, and so it came out of that into Christianity naturally, but there's been a lot of talk of that. Another thing that people would say was a big influence from this day and age that continues on is the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church. The organization of the church hierarchy is based on the political organizations of the Roman Empire, and then baptism is an important thing that we've talked about already. We talked about a baptistry, but it's basically an act of being immersed in water. Sometimes nowadays, for a long time, they've also done it by sprinkling water or pouring water on people to say that they're converting or that they believe in repenting and believing. So basically, the idea of being washed and made new, being reborn. That's also happened in some other Near Eastern beliefs as well, to a certain extent. All right, so that kind of gives you a basic idea of some things we'll see quite a lot of. I want to talk a little bit more about this guy. We've already seen him a bit. He was a Yugoslavian emperor who came to power around 300 AD, and he was an emperor during the last phase of the combined emperor. He was a low-born emperor who became emperor through battle success, and he's most famous for a couple of things. One of them being the Edict of Milan, which happened in 313, some sources say 312, which is the legalization of Christianity. A lot of people have different ideas about why he legalized it. This is sort of a picture of a vision that he said that he had of, in this sign you will conquer. He conquered against his rival Maximus, and it was in a sign of the cross. So he may have actually been a Christian. It's said that he was baptized on his deathbed, but he may have also legalized it because the population of Christians was growing, and there was no way to kind of stop the tides from turning that way, and he needed more military recruits. Different people say different things about it. Maybe it's a combination of all of those things. Another thing that he was infamous for was he moved the capital from Rome all the way over to Constantinople, which is modern day Istanbul in Turkey. There's a song about this. Istanbul, Constantinople, Istanbul. I won't make you listen to me any longer about it, but nonetheless, that's something else he's famous for. He wanted to avoid the invasion of Germanic tribes, and he couldn't hold Italy any longer, so he moved it here because Istanbul is easily defended. It's got three sides of water, the Bosphorus, and the sea down here. And it was also a really rich area. There was a lot of wealth here, and he wanted the money basically. And because of that, he moved it, and he could still have a united Roman Empire that he ruled over. Later on, Theodus the First divided his empire at his death. He's the one who made Christianity the state religion in 380. He divided it between his sons in the west and the east, and then we'll see in the next chapter that the west falls, but the east carries on. This area of the world carries on as the Byzantium Empire until 1495. So in chapter 9, we'll talk more about how these emperors considered themselves Roman emperors and much more that goes on with that. But before we get into anything then, chapter 9, let's carry on with this chapter. This is where we're going to talk a bit about the influence of religion and art in the late antiquity, and also how art and architecture changed as a result of Christianity and decisions of Constantine to legalize it. So that's what we're going to talk about in the next section in this chapter's lecture number 2. So chapter 8, lecture 2, we'll start off talking about early Christian architecture and how it was affected quite a lot by this man and his decision to legalize Christianity, which made the need for larger places of worship, because they no longer had to meet in houses or places like the catacombs any longer. And so that created a necessity for a different type of architecture, which we'll talk about how that developed. And we'll look at one important example, which is the old St. Peter's Basilica. Okay, so we'll talk about that in the next lecture, which is lecture 2 of chapter 8. Okay, guys, make sure you're reading that book, and you should be reading up to the pages that are in the outline and the syllabus. Take care. I'll talk to you soon.